Chapter 21. Turning the Tables. Sarah's face was wet, whether from the stream of tears running down her cheeks or the splashes of cold, still water that had sprung to meet her when she fell, or some combination of the two. She couldn't be sure. All she knew was that, in that moment, it was the only sensation that she was aware of. She was so injured that her brain was trying to spare itself a bad time by ignoring every other part of her. It didn't hurt, at least not at the moment, but Sarah knew that things were bad. Without access to life energy and no one on hand to apply healing techniques to her, she might not ever recover properly from these injuries. Even if by some miracle Monty decided not to take her soul, she might not ever fight again. A realization like that probably would have petrified Joe or Tucker, who had both fallen in love with soul fighting at a young age, but Sarah found it to be only mildly annoying. She had other things going on beside heart-to-hearts. She hadn't chosen to fight the Soul Takers again to protect her ability to use soul. Why did I fight them? She wondered, her mind in a haze. She had to think about it. That's right. It's because taking my soul might kill me. She nodded slightly. That was it. She'd been fighting for her life, and to prove herself. She remembered that now, too. She'd wanted to prove that, even without access to her life energy, she was just as good as everyone else. She had, however, failed completely. She'd failed to prove her worth, and she'd failed to save her own life. All she could do now was wait for Monty to do whatever he was going to do. She wondered, briefly, if the process of having her soul ripped from her body would hurt, but she decided that she didn't care. I wonder how the others are doing, she thought. It was a fleeting concern. They had to be doing better than she was. They'd grown over the course of their recent training, while Sarah had not. Even if she had survived today's heart-to-heart, would she have ever grown stronger as a soul fighter again? She didn't think so. It didn't surprise her that she couldn't control life energy. She had always seen life energy as good and pure, as the energy that healers use to fix people. So it made sense that Sarah, that someone as selfish as herself, couldn't master it. Even now, while her friends were still fighting, she was more concerned with her own problems. It was just like when she had hurt Joe by implying that no one could understand her, even though Joe faced many of the same problems that Sarah herself did, even though Joe couldn't train to use their mom's techniques either. Maybe Sarah was just getting what she deserved. Maybe this was karma, or some such thing, for being so angry and self-centered all the time. She had failed because she didn't deserve to succeed. It made a certain kind of sense. Sarah didn't deserve to win, so she didn't. She sobbed again, and new tears began rolling down the sides of her face, sliding into the water all around her. She thought that she was resigned to her sorrow, but some part of her had other ideas. Out of nowhere, memories of Joe flashed in her mind. She remembered the first time that she had seen her sister use soul. They had both been much younger then, back before either of their souls had awakened into unique forms, back before Joe's soul had turned unnatural, back when Joe could still train with their mom. Sarah had, at the time, been too young to join in, but Shannon had encouraged her to watch. Joe, as amazing then as she was now, had learned quickly how to harness soul in a past lesson. Now she was learning to use life energy mixed with her soul to generate more of both. Concentrate, Shannon had said. She and Joe sat opposite each other, legs crossed in meditation poses. Focus your mind on the core of yourself. Who are you? What do you care about? Knowing who you are deep down, you'll start to feel a warm sensation in your tummy. That's your life energy. And once you find it, you can use the same force of will that you used to control your soul last time to mix the energies together. She waited while young Joe visibly strained. Then, after several long minutes, Joe's face became relaxed. I did it, she announced. Her eyes flew open, and even the untrained Sarah could feel the pressure of the waves of soul rolling off of her sister's body. Good, Shannon had said. Now be careful. You have a lot of soul, Joe. You're my daughter, after all. You have to be careful when generating more soul like this. Until you get the hang of it, you risk building up too much and your soul going out of control, leaving you all burned out. As Shannon had explained these things, Joe went back to straining, but the pressure being emitted by her soul continued to grow stronger. At her young age, Sarah hadn't realized that her sister was actually in danger. As the soul had continued to fill the air around them, Sarah had been impressed by the sight of her sister sitting in the middle of it, her hair and her clothing fluttering wildly, even though there was no wind. Then Joe had gotten control of her soul again and had stopped generating more. Her churning energy left the air, but it didn't leave Sarah's mind. She'd forgotten about that moment, but now that she remembered it again, she was sure that that was the moment that she had decided that she would also train to fight with soul, so that she could be like her mom and her big sister. Even if she didn't end up going anywhere as a soul fighter, she wanted to, at the very least, share that one thing with her family. Had she ever said so? Thinking back, she couldn't remember the words that she'd used, but she must have said something. She remembered that, as the lesson had come to an end, Joe had walked over to Sarah, messed up her curly blonde hair, and said, "That was pretty cool, wasn't it? You're too little to learn that yet, but I know you will. You're my little sister, and you can do anything." Out of nowhere, the resignation that she had been feeling melted away. Sarah had never managed to harness her life energy. She'd become pretty strong on her own, but she had failed to live up to her sister's expectations. Letting herself down was one thing, but she refused to let her sister down. This was her last chance. No more telling herself excuses or accepting failure. This time she would do it. This time she would succeed. She'd excluded failure as an option, so she had no other choice. Suddenly, Sarah was fully aware. She saw Monty standing over her, still waiting to see if she could continue, but she ignored him, distracted by the pain. Her body was screaming at her, making sure she knew in no uncertain terms just how broken she was, how cold she was. It was almost enough to dissuade her, but she fought through it, clenching her hands, digging her fingers into the soft mud beneath her. She reached out with her senses. She didn't hesitate, and doubting herself never even entered her mind. Life from the earth, she thought, envisioning Shannon's signature technique in her mind, and she felt warmth flow through her. It joined with a pool of warmth in her core that Sarah recognized as her life energy, and that energy spread to every inch of her body. Blinding golden light surrounded her. She could feel her broken bones mending and her bruises fading. Then that warmth found the tiny amount of remaining soul deep within her gut. She was surprised by how quickly that soul expanded to match the level of life energy, and how quickly both energies ground against each other and continued to increase even past that point. In only an instant, Sarah was renewed. Energy surrounded her, rolling off of her in waves of intense pressure, displacing the water around her in a perfect half-sphere. It was just like what had happened to Joe all those years ago, but to a much greater degree. Sarah watched Monty take a cautious step back as she rose up in the center of that sphere of pressure. She should have been at risk of the same thing that young Joe had been, of becoming too saturated with soul, it all going out of control and burning her out. But she realized that her many years of training to manage and control her soul so perfectly and precisely had armed her with control that the other dueling hearts could only dream of. As her soul continued to build, she was able to immediately seize control of it and put it to use. Sarah's soul exploded out into the space charged by the clashing energy of the heart-to-heart. The water all around her rose into the air at once, ready to spring forward at her command. She took a moment to marvel at it all, at how effortlessly she could hold it up, running her fingers through the suspended liquid. She smiled and turned her gaze to meet her opponent's eyes. "I'm giving you one chance to leave," she told him, "before I make you regret staying." As Lawrence approached Jen, and Jen resigned herself to the idea that she was about to lose, Lawrence slowed. He raised both of his arms, still wrapped in their attack avatars, crossing them over his face and chest. His eyes were wide as he gazed past Jen, over her shoulder. Jen turned her head to try and spot whatever it was that Lawrence had seen, just in time to see a pair of approaching fireballs. She tensed as the heat of the blast singed her hair and her face, but the fireballs flew over her shoulders toward her opponent. Jen turned back toward Lawrence. The fireballs hit his defenses, exploding against his avatar arms, damaging them and pushing him back. 2 more fireballs passed Jen, hitting him again, followed by 2 more, and then another 2. They came in rapid succession, their paths curving wildly and erratically. All that Lawrence could do was block and be pushed further and further away. Finally, when Lawrence had been pushed to the far end of the ball court, his assailant made himself known. Tucker jumped up next to Jen. He still looked pale, and blood still stained his clothing, but he wasn't actively bleeding out anymore, and Jen could see through the hole in his shirt that the wound was closed, leaving behind a deep, nasty scar. As Tucker landed, he punched the ground. "Wall of fire!" he cried, and jets of flames erupted from beneath the asphalt in a ring around Lawrence, forming a barrier. It wouldn't take Lawrence long to shake off the heat of the wall and the shock of the assault and fly out of Tucker's trap. But Tucker had still bought Jen and himself some small amount of time. "Tucker," Jen said, surprised, "you're okay." She felt as shocked as she sounded, and Tucker picked up on it. He smiled. "Thanks to you," he said. "I tried to put up a healing aura after he dropped me, but I blacked out before I could. Then you gave me your healing aura, and it brought me back from the brink. My healing aura was still on my mind, so I was able to get mine up alongside yours without you guys noticing. The 2 auras worked together to stitch me up enough to get back into the fight." Tucker met her eyes. He was genuinely appreciative of Jen's help. She could see it in his expression, but he didn't say any more about it. Instead, he asked, "You can give soul to people too, right? Like put your gravity soul into them?" Jen nodded. "Can you do it so it makes them lighter, not heavier?" Jen nodded again. Tucker smiled, wide and wicked. "Then in that case, I think I have an idea how to beat this guy. All we have to do is take a risk and work together." Jen didn't particularly like the idea of Tucker rejoining the fight. He wasn't fully healed yet. He could still reopen his wound if he strained himself too much. But glancing back in Lawrence's direction, she didn't see any other choice. "Okay," she said reluctantly. "Tell me what you're thinking." Jo laughed. She laughed as robustly as she could with so many of her ribs broken. She wasn't looking to surprise Karen, but she still took note when she did. Karen looked cute when she was caught off guard, which just made Jo laugh even harder. That was the last straw, though. Pain shot through her torso, and she winced. Slowly, she pushed herself into a sitting position, or at least the closest to one that she could muster. She looked Karen in the eyes, and she said, casually, "I've never met anyone like you." Karen waited, expecting Jo to say more, and Jo didn't intend to disappoint her. "You're wildly strong," she said. "I've only met one person who might be stronger than you. Fighting you has been terrifying, but also the most fun I've ever had in my life. I don't understand it. But as much as I want to beat you and get you to leave, I also don't ever want to see you go. It just doesn't make sense. No one has ever made me feel this way before." "I've enjoyed my time with you too," Karen told Jo, and once again the smile that tugged at her lips seemed absolutely genuine. "But I'm sorry. It's not ideal, but we have no choice but to do what we came here to do. It's our safest option, because your leader will hurt you if he finds out that you let us go," Jo said. She understood. It finally made sense to her. Karen, Monty, and Lawrence, all that they had done and said, they had never once seemed enthusiastic about the idea of taking the Dueling Heart's soul. Karen had even said that they often avoided taking soul from fighters that they defeated where their colleagues wouldn't have. They were afraid of their leader, so they did as he said, but they didn't like it. Karen didn't say anything, but the sad gleam in her eyes told Jo that she was right. "Is he really that dangerous?" Jo asked. "That even the three of you have to worry about it?" Again, Karen didn't respond. Jo frowned. Some part of her had hoped that she and Karen could talk, that she could convince Karen to abandon the Soul Takers and what? Jo wondered to herself. Did she think that Karen would stay with her and become her... Was friend even the right word? It was just as funny now as it had been when it had first crossed her mind and inspired her to laughter, and so her laughter resumed and she fell once again prone. Karen watched her awkwardly until this latest fit died down as well, and Jo lay there, quiet and still. "I'm sorry about this," Karen said again. "I hope you're able to recover enough soul that we can fight again sometime." She took a step toward her fallen opponent, but before she got any closer than that, she stopped. Her clothes fluttered and her hair stretched behind her into the darkness of the night, moving on their own, even though there was no wind. By all indications, Jo had been defeated, and yet, as she lay there, soul rolled off of her in waves. Struggling against the pain, she forced her soul and her life energy to mix. It built up slowly at first, but increased exponentially with each second that passed. Karen had to step back even further as Jo's soul erupted, compressing the ground beneath her, causing it to shatter and collapse. Jo amped her soul up more and more, so much so that she was left crying out in pain as she strained with her entire will to keep her energies from flying out of control. She pushed her soul further than she ever had, mixing it with her life energy for longer than she thought possible. It overflowed, pouring from her body into the air around her, reaching high into the sky, above the trees, lighting up the night with a pillar of deep purple light. Jo was taking a risk. She was nearing her limits. Any moment she might burn out, losing access to her soul in any form for several days' time. And she would be even more helpless than she already was, but she didn't have a choice. Generating this much soul energy was the only way for her to, likewise, generate enough life energy to reach all of her injuries at once. It wasn't as impressive an amount as Sarah had managed to absorb with the Life from the Earth technique, but it was enough to mend most of her worst injuries fast enough to get her back into the fight. Finally, after several long, painful seconds, Jo allowed her energies to spring apart. She cried out again as she strained and reined in whatever of her soul she could before it faded into the starry sky. She stood in the center of the trench that her soul had made, wrapped in the brightest aura that she had ever created. Through force of will and little else, she had managed to bring herself back from the brink. Winning was possible again. Jo was still exhausted, however, her stamina reserves low. The life energy that she had created had been spent mending broken bones. there hadn't been enough to renew her completely. The stress of maintaining an aura was already wearing her down again. If she was going to turn this heart-to-heart around, she couldn't approach it the same way as before. Jo looked up at the lip of the trench, where Karen stood looking down on her, something like pride flashing in her eyes. She smiled, and Karen smiled back. The two young fighters seemed to flicker out of existence as they sprang toward each other at the best speed that they could still muster, and their heart-to-heart resumed. Meanwhile, back at Wilson's dojo, Wilson continued to observe the dueling hearts with Shannon at his side. Some of his tension had subsided in the wake of what had just happened, of what the dueling hearts had each just managed to do. The word miracle even came to mind. "I told you," Shannon said, her eyes beaming with pride. Despite her words, however, she held her fists clenched tightly, anxiously at her sides. Her girls had been able to keep themselves in the fight, but that fight wasn't over yet.